Just a few minutes past time for us to begin. We are going to be jumping into lesson 11 in just a moment. We are quickly drawing near to the end of our study of grace, and I know that I have greatly enjoyed it. I hope that you all have as well. And I also hope that it has challenged you to think about God's grace, maybe in a new way, maybe just to revisit it and to be reminded of things that you already knew. And not this Wednesday. This Wednesday we're going to be wrapping up lesson 11, but next Wednesday will be the very last class of this quarter. And depending on how far Luke gets done on that Sunday prior, we may have time, I hope we have time, to look at the questions on page 27. It's technically lesson 13. We may not have an opportunity to get to it, but if we do, these review questions, if we don't have a chance to get to it, take some time yourself to go through those questions, answer them for yourself. I would love to talk with you, even if we don't get to do it in class. We can talk about it after class. I'm sure Luke would love that as well. Just some things that you've taken away from this, some things that you still have questions about. If you still have questions, bring them up to Luke, and Luke will answer them for you. He's not here today, so I can put him on the spot. But even if we don't get to that, as I said, I would love to be able to discuss that together and see what has changed or what we have understood better about grace through the course of this study. In just a moment, Robbie, do you care to lead us in a prayer in a moment? In just a moment, I'm going to ask Robbie Bellwood to lead us in an opening prayer, and then we will get into the case study. But before we do that, I wanted to start class off the question that kind of came to my mind as I prepared for this, and as I thought back on the whole quarter that we've been looking at grace, that is it possible for us to be dependent on God and simultaneously rely on our own strength? Rely on the strength that you have. Is it possible for you to be dependent on God and at the same time rely on yourself? Thoughts? Yay, nay? Where are we at on that?
You have to be a good steward of yourself, but you can't really rely on it.
Hank says we have to be good stewards of ourselves, stewards of the things that we are entrusted in, and yet relying on ourselves, something we can't rely on ourselves. That's a good point. What else? Can we rely on ourselves and rely on God? Okay. Yeah, a good point, good way to think about it. Relying on God, submitting or surrendering to God is a way for God to work through us, work in us. Might shed some help us think about this more. Those of you all that are coming in, the question that we're considering before we begin class: can we depend on God and simultaneously rely on our own strength? Any other thoughts? Yeah. So Tara brings up the fact that we are not robots. We've been created with free will. God is the one that is giving us strength. God is the one who is placing power into our lives to overcome, but we are still required to make decisions. How are we going to use what God provides us? So we're not robots. We still have to make our own choices. I want you to keep thinking about that question. It's not fair that I spring that on you at the beginning of class, and I'm not expecting any discussion. I really just want to kind of get our brains going this morning before we jump in. Think about that question as we go through the course of this study today and Wednesday. Can we depend on God and at the same time rely on our own strength? Maybe we'll have a chance to come back to that later on. Before we do, Robbie, I'm going to ask you to lead us in an opening word of prayer.
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this beautiful day you've given us. The sun's shining and flowers are beginning to bloom. We're just glorified to see your creation this time of learn more about grace and growing in grace and just the love that you showed us by giving your son. We're just so thankful for the time we can worship you this day. We pray that our worship to you is in spirit and truth, that we concentrate on the songs and the prayers and the lesson later today. We're just so blessed to be among friends and family, and we just pray that we share that with the world, and we continue to live lives that reflect you, and that others see that, and they want to emulate that as well. We know that this world is so evil in a lot of ways. We know the troubles in Ukraine, and we just pray that your will be done, that you can help solve that crisis, and that peace comes to that area. We pray that you're continue to be with the Christians there as well, and not just there, but around the world. We know that there's evil everywhere, and we just pray that your guiding hand helps them. Again, be with us this day, and we thank you most of all for your son. In his name we pray.
Amen. So before we read the case study, I'm just going to make this comment, and I'm not looking for any hands to be raised. It was very interesting to me, the timing of this study. One, because Holly and I had just, in the past several months, paid off a credit card that was incredibly unrewarding. It had nothing to offer you other than a little bit of credit. And so we had decided to pay that off and to stop using that card and try to find something that would help us out a little bit, especially as we travel from time to time. So we were planning that. And at the same time, I come into the building one day and go into my office, and hanging on my door is a copy of Dave Ramsey's Financial Planner book. And I thought, maybe somebody's trying to give me a message here. So after all that has happened, we come to lesson 11, and I kind of had to chuckle when I read through the case study. And if you haven't read through it yet, we'll read through it together. Maybe you'll see why. The last few years have been tough for Mark. While in college, he had gotten his first credit card and started living beyond his means. He didn't realize the problems this would cause. He rarely stopped to consider if he needed something. He rarely stopped to consider if he could afford something. He had believed the commercials when they said he had a right to the things he wanted. It never occurred to him that buying and buying and buying, even though he didn't really have the money, was a potential sign of covetousness. In fact, he never considered it any kind of problem until the fights with his wife started. Every month, they fought over money. When the kids came along, it got worse. That's when medical bills started and the clothing needs increased. They were making it until Mark was shockingly turned down for a credit card. He was maxed out with 2 car payments, a house payment, a boat payment, medical bills, credit card debt. The banks decided he was no longer worth the risk. That was especially true since he was having to take turns on various months for which bills he would actually pay. That's when he called one of the elders to get some help. The elders sat down with Mark and his wife and helped them develop a budget. They cut up all the credit cards, sold the boats, one of the cars. Mark was willing to do anything at that point because he was tired of the creditors' calls and tired of fighting with his wife. He admitted that he was powerless over his finances and just needed to surrender himself to God and His grace, letting God's way govern his finances. And God had helped. They were paying off debt, and he had received a promotion. Things were moving in the right direction. They argued much less. They knew how much money they had. They were never afraid that a check would bounce. They were really breathing easier. So when the last credit card offer came in the mail, Mark decided it was okay to get back in the credit business. He had everything under control now. It wasn't going to be a problem for him. He wouldn't tell the elders who were helping him with his budget. He would just take care of it because he could now. So I want to get a few things out of the way before we get started in this discussion this morning. Number one, this discussion is not about the dangers of credit card. This class is not about being a good steward of your finances. And so as much as it is that we might want to take this class in that discussion, and when I say we, I mean me, this is a reminder for me as much as everybody else, it's not what the purpose of this is. We can certainly see the dangers of covetousness and greed, but we need to understand this class this morning is focused on grace and focused on what we see and what we learn about grace through this case study. We're not going to develop financial planning tools and how to escape debt off of this. We do want to, however, discover the importance of the title of our lesson, Growing in Grace. What does that mean? How can we do that? How can we become aware if we're not doing that? So these are things that I hope to take from this and the following lesson on Wednesday. So I want to get into the book for a minute. We're going to jump into some of the questions, but before we do that, is there anything about this case study that looks like it's going right? Is there anything that stands out to you right away that says, there is grace here? This guy does have an understanding of what's going on with the power of God to overcome sin.
We went to discuss this with the elders and started making strides, and there were some obvious results that came from that. I mean, it was obvious his financial parts of that was getting better. Things were more under control than they ever had been.
Absolutely. So that's one of the huge things that stands out first off is he got to a point where he admitted, I can't do this on my own. I'm trying to overcome this, and I am failing again and again and again, and I need help. And so he turned to some of the help that God has provided us. He turned to the shepherds that are watching over him. And not only that, as Jason pointed out, results started not necessarily because he just turned to them, but because he listened to them. In one of our previous studies, we saw a picture of people who came to that same point. We've got a problem. We can't overcome it. We're going to go to the elder. We're going to talk about it. But when the elder gave advice, they said, no, that's not what we want to do. We don't want to surrender to that. We don't want to give in to that. We want to try to find a way where we can still do things that we want to do and yet have the result of hope or of righteousness or of purification come from that. This guy had been driven to the point where he said, I can't do it on my own, and I need God's help, and I'm willing to do whatever it is that can get me out of this. I'm willing to surrender. In fact, that was the words that he used in the case study. I'm going to surrender to God's grace because I can't do this on my own. So right off the bat, we see some really big indicators that this guy does have an understanding of grace. He knows that I have a desire to do what's right, but I'm failing at it. I need help. And I'm going to turn to God for that help. And whatever it is that it takes, I'm going to do that. I'm going to submit to it. I'm going to surrender. I'm going to give up to Christ. But what are some things that also occur in here that make you think maybe that is not going to happen? Or what's going to be the ramifications at the end of the case study with the way he addresses picking up another credit card? What do you think is going to happen?
I guess because he got smarter, he gave him no credit card, he can maintain that one by himself.
All right, so Barry says he's going to get this other credit card and maybe maintain it by himself, use it responsibly. Okay? What does other people think?
Well, that was his intention, but that might not work that way.
Oh, okay, yeah. So Barry says he intends to do that. It might not work out that way. Aaron?
I think we're seeing the first step of his travel backsliding into old habits.
Yeah.
It's no different than someone who has trouble with alcohol. They abstain and they go, well, it's just a couple fingers of whiskey.
Yeah.
It's just one night. You know, I've been good for the last 6 months. Just one drink, and you know what? They're right back where they were before.
Right.
I'm afraid that this gentleman is taking that same path.
Yeah, so one possible outcome for this for certain, and one that I think is most likely for us to recognize and worry about, is the fact that he's going to fall right back into debt, right back into his old habits, become a problem again with covetousness and greed.
Well, it would be nice to think that his intentions were good, but then when he says, well, I'm not going to tell the elders,
Yeah.
he's already had it in his heart, not just his mind, but his heart, that he has to hide something.
Yeah, so hang on to that thought, and we'll come back to that, because I think we need to talk about some of those things that we see in the way that he handles the issue. Because, as Barry also pointed out, he has intentions, and it's very possible that he is going to get another credit card, and he is going to use it responsibly. That he has learned lessons from what he experienced before, and what he was driven to a point of hopelessness and despair, and he surrendered himself to God, and through the power of God, he was brought out of that situation, and he learned something from it. And so it's very possible that he's going to go forward from here, and he's going to take what he has learned, and he's going to utilize it to make better decisions. Again, I think when we look at that question number one, what do you think is going to happen? My first notion is to go, nothing good. But that doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen. I think that's an important thing. And going back to our question at the very beginning of class, can we rely and depend on the strength of God and also rely on ourselves? I think there's a portion of this study that starts to flesh that question out, that starts to cause us to look at what that looks like in a way that that's possible, in a way that still glorifies and honors God. Because there's some things that we recognize about this guy that we've already mentioned. He's felt the crushing weight of debt. He's felt the pain of being in a problem that I can't do anything about. And he has found the actual way out. He's found the truth about God's grace. That doesn't mean that he can't fall again into that same pattern, but we do hope that it means that he has learned something from it. Turn over to Titus chapter 2 for a moment. We've looked at this passage a couple times. We may even look at it a couple times more before the study ends. But in Titus chapter 2, we learn something about grace. It says in verse 11, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men." Verse 12, instructing us to deny ungodliness and worldly desires and live sensibly and righteously and godly in the present age. Is it possible to live in a godly manner, denying worldly desires, sensibly and righteously with a credit card? I would argue, yes, it is possible to do that. So one of the first things I want us to see in this situation is while the case study uses this credit card to draw our attention to a problem, we need to recognize that the actual problem lies deeper than the credit card. It lies deeper than what the case study is bringing up for us, getting back to some of the things that were brought up by Natalie in the question. So let's go to number 2 as we continue to try to unpack that. What demonstrates to you that his decisions to get another credit card is a shift back to depending on his own strength and not depending on God's? Is there anything in the case study that stands out to you that demonstrates? I think it's very easy for us quickly to go, he got another credit card, he's depending on himself now. I think there's things in the case study that indicate that outside of the credit card. Absolutely. That is a big one, that personal pronoun. I've got this. Hank?
Well, when you're in sin before you even come into Christ, once you do come into Christ, you're given that responsibility to learn what you need to do. So in defense of, he may understand what he's doing now. He's already had to before.
Yeah.
In a certain sense. I mean, he failed, obviously, but now he's got a better understanding of him than he possibly could. Because, like I said, before you come into Christ, you've got all that sin that you have to get rid of. Not you personally, but, just so things you're going to have to discard in your life. And yes, it's God's grace that helps you through it, but ultimately, your decision to do it or not.
Yeah, so Hank brings up a really good point that before we are in Christ, we have this problem of sin that's laid upon us, a problem that we can't do anything with. Romans 3:23, we have all sinned. Romans 6:23, the wages of that is death. There's nothing I can do to get rid of that. But through God's grace, our sin is being removed, and we're being taught how to live, how to walk, is in fact the word that we see used most predominantly through Scriptures. Walking in a way that is proper, walking as children of light. The way that we behave, the way that we walk, God's grace is not just taking our sin away, it's instructing us, this is how you move forward in this world of sin, in this world of wickedness. And that's going to also apply here with the issue that we see at hand. Also, what Tara brought up, it's such an important thing to see in this. I mean, you go back and count how many times. He has everything under control. It won't be a problem for him. He would just take care of it because he can now. He is focused entirely on himself at the end of this. Everything that he is saying says, I've got this under control. And what Natalie brought up too, I think is such a huge indicator that we need to be very cautious. We need to be very afraid at this moment because what he says is, I'll just hide this. I'll hide this from the people that are around me. I'll hide this from the people that have helped me come through this, through the grace of God. They have shown me a way that I can overcome this problem, and I don't want them to know about it. You have to wonder, even though it doesn't say he's hiding this from the elders, is he also hiding this from his wife? Because that created part of the problem that got us to where we were to begin with, the fighting. All the fighting that was going on in this relationship. I didn't like that. I was wanting to find some answer to that. Maybe there is a great deal of fear here that this fighting will pick up again. And so I'm going to hide it from my wife as well. Again, that's not in the case study. That's just a presumption. But the fact that we're hiding this, one, indicates that maybe we don't have it under control. But two, indicates that I don't really like the advice that they may give me. Because he may go to them and say, look, you all helped me see so much. The problem that I was in, where I went astray. I was, if we remember back to the beginning of the case study, buying and buying and buying without thinking about whether I could afford it, without thinking about whether I needed it. It was just, I want it and I have a right to it. I don't think that way anymore. In fact, here's my plan. Here's a budget. Here's a way that I want to try to use this in a godly manner to not go beyond our means and not fall back into these same paths. What do you think? Do you think that's a good idea? How much different would we think about this case study if he had opened himself up to the elders to say, look, you all helped me see a lot about God's power, and I want to keep using that. I think there's a way I can do that and still have this in my life. Is it possible? I think we would have a much different view of this guy if he had approached it that way. If he had said, you know what, I know that I couldn't do this before, but I have learned something from God about covetousness, about what I need and what I don't need, about looking at things and saying, I might want that, but that's just not something that is available to us right now, and it's not a wise decision for me to try to take whatever it costs, whether I have it or not, and seek it out. So I don't want to use a credit card for that, but there are uses that might help me, might benefit my family. I think we might view Mark in a different light if just that last paragraph was worded a little bit different. If his thoughts about what he was about to do were slightly different. That's what I want to, that's one thing that I hope to bring out in the course of this study, is that the Mark that we see at the end is very, very similar to the Mark that we see at the beginning. The Mark who in college picked up that credit card and said, hey, this is an answer to my problems. And now at the end of this lesson, or at the end of the case study, I am still an answer to my problems. I've got this. I don't need the elders. I don't need anybody else. I can get me through this. Are there any biblical characters that come to your mind when you think about that sort of mindset? Someone who has followed God in some way, that has witnessed the power of God to overcome, to bring them through, and then yet in the midst of that great power, made incredibly self-reliant decisions that were foolish, that led them to where God did not want them to be. David, certainly. What's some thoughts about David?
Well, I mean, there's many things through his life that are obvious, but one was the census.
Yeah,
He took the census, and that one really angered God.
absolutely.
He was taking it upon himself to see the greatness of his nation. And
That's a fantastic one. God had done so much. As David, from a young man up into king, God has been giving him power and victory. And when it comes time for a battle, he wants to see, well, what's the strength of my nation? What power do I have? And as Shane points out, is very upsetting to God. Doesn't lead to a good place. Doesn't lead to God being glorified in that moment. That's a fantastic one. What else? Jacob. Absolutely. Jacob is this amazing picture of someone who is, as you said, self-reliant. He's self-reliant on what he has to offer. He's a deceiver. He's a tricker. He's going to get what he wants through his own means. He comes to this point, we talked about Genesis 32 a few weeks back, comes to this point where he realizes, I have nothing left to give. And he is just grappling on to this figure that he wrestles with in the wilderness, an angel of the Lord. He is wrestling with him and seemingly begging, I'm not letting go till you give me a blessing. I need you to bless me. I can't bless myself in this moment. And he grows from that. We see a change in him. We see the power of that as he approaches Esau. He's going to put himself out front instead of putting all of his family, instead of putting everything else. He's going to go. He's going to approach Esau. He's going to fall before him, beg for forgiveness. There's this huge change in this man. But yet then when he has children, and especially when someone is terribly mistreats one of his daughters, some of these old habits come back out again. He doesn't want to justify or to find justice for her. It's all about, well, what can I do to try to make sure I'm not cut off in this moment? Doesn't trust in God, just completely trusts in what he can do in that moment. It's a terrible failure in that situation. Any other ones? Jacob, David, Jonah. So tell me something about Jonah.
God was sending him to Nineveh, and he, in his own mind, decided, they're not worthy of it, so I'm going to just go do what I want to do. And even at the end, after doing it, he still refused to see what good comes from it.
Yeah, I mean, Jonah being cast into the sea, should have died, spared by God, spared by his grace, comes through this, seeing that, looks like he's on the right path at least, goes in and preaches. Michael Ray said it the best the other day in one of our podcasts. He preached the Safe Auto version of the gospel, the bare minimum, quick and to the point. 40 days, God is going to destroy the city. Seems like he has learned something, but yet at the end of it, he hasn't learned anything. He's still just furious, angry that God would do anything about this. Aaron. Yeah.
He practiced magic, evidently. He was very good at it. He heard the gospel, he believed, was baptized, and then he realized that I can make money from the things that the apostles are doing. And he asks for his gifts to be given to him. So he believed, and then back.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think all of these, and I appreciate you bringing that one up, especially from the New Testament, where we see that, a picture of that happening under the very covenant that we live under. They're all pictures of the fact that we certainly are recipients of God's grace. We can make it useless, though. We can, the term we might use is fall from it. We can fall from that grace. And what is the key that is occurring? The key that's occurring is that we're not growing in it. That we're the same that we were from the moment we left, or the moment that we first felt that. We're continuing in these old paths. We're turning back to these old ways. We're turning back away from the good that God has shown us, the love that he has put in our lives. Simon the Sorcerer is a fantastic example of that, as well as all of these. One that stands out to me is Abraham. Genesis chapter 20 and verses 1 through 3, we see Abraham trying to use his own cunning deception to preserve his life in the face of a great king. If you want to turn over there with me, we'll read just a little bit about that. Genesis chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. Now Abraham journeyed from there towards the land of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. And then he sojourned in Gerar. Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is married." Poor Abimelech. Just imagine what his life feels like. I've met this beautiful woman. She's going to be my wife. And he wakes up in the middle of the night to this dream of God. "You are a dead man, Abimelech. There is no, you've made a decision that wasn't very good. You've been lied to. There is a consequence that's falling upon you for what is happening right now." So we know the rest of the story. He goes back to Abraham and asks him to explain. The thing is that I want to focus on is where Abraham started at the beginning of all this. He started far, far away from where he is now. He started in the land of his family. In chapter 12, he is called out of Ur. He is called into a land that God has said, "I'm going to give to you." He is given a promise by the God of all life, of creation. "I'm going to give you life. I'm going to give you a child. I'm going to give you seed that is going to become a great nation, that is going to bless the entire earth. I'm going to give you the land that you are in." He's given all this, and he follows. He knows, I haven't done anything to deserve this, but I'm going to follow it. I'm going to trust this God and follow him wherever he sends. And in chapter 12, we see this happen the first time. It happens again as he goes into Egypt. Or not again, it happens the first time as he goes into Egypt. And he learns from that. God graciously allows him, God has every right to say, "You know what? I've picked the wrong guy. I'm going to pick somebody else." But God graciously continues to allow him to be the recipient of this promise. I'm going to be unto my name. I'm going to be the God that is going to bless you because I've said that I will. And throughout his life, he doubts. He tries to take matters into his own hands with his wife's handmaid. He asks God, "Maybe you're going to do it through a part of my family instead of through me." He just continually shows that I don't still quite get what you're doing. All the way up here to chapter 20 when he goes back to the very things that he has already done. Abraham is also a picture of someone that's just they're not growing in grace. And yet I think something fantastic about Abraham, Hebrews chapter 11 says he is a Hall of Fame member, if we will. Again, I don't like that term, but he is a picture of someone with great faith. Even though he's a picture of someone that doesn't get it and that fails and struggles repeatedly through their lives. Just like we see here in chapter 20, Hebrews 11 says this is a guy to look to. One thing that tells me, the people that are mentioned there in Hebrews chapter 11 are just like you and me. They're not some sort of superhuman that was able to wrestle with the righteousness of God and attain it for themselves because of their greater intellect, because of their greater faith. They're examples of faith just because of the opposites of those, because they didn't get it. They weren't superhuman. They didn't have some sort of great advantage, and yet they just trusted. And they relied. Even though they failed, they continued to repent and turn back to him. I think if Mark were growing in grace, well, verse 3, if Mark were growing in grace, what do you think would be different? What decisions do you think he would make regarding this card? And specifically, why do you think he would make those decisions regarding this card? If he was growing in grace, what decisions would he make and why?
I think either one of two things. Either he would just outright reject it, like, "Nope, been down that road before, not going to do that again," or even being open with the elders, "Hey, see this, what do you think about it? Is there a way that we could do this that would be helpful, healthy, and
Yeah. Ultimately, I think that's a big point. I agree with that, Jason, that he's going to either reject it or he's going to be more open about it, not try to hide it. What else? What other thoughts come to your mind? Yeah. So for just a moment, we have Mark and the elders in this that he's spoken to. What other characters do we have in this case study? His wife, Who else? Children. We have children in this case study as well. He's been buying clothes as his children come along. There's a lot more than just Mark. Even though he's the focus of this case study involves a lot of people. And that's a really good point, that maybe he's acting very selfishly. If he was growing in God's grace, it might cause him to think a little less about how I want this, how this is a stature maybe, and say, hey, look, I've got this, and with it I can buy the things that I want that is going to make me look or feel like the man that I want to look and feel like. Maybe if he had been growing grace, he could think about, well, what's this going to do to the relationship I have with my wife? What's this going to do to my relationship with Christ, obviously, number one, but my wife, or what about my children? What about the things that they truly need that I might be throwing away because I'm going to fall right back into the same problems that we had before, into debt, and not be able to get myself out again? I think that's a great one to think about. That growing in grace, it would cause him to think less selfishly and more selflessly. What else? Certainly. Yeah, trying to keep up with the Joneses, that just this perception that I have of the world around me. And what that tells me is where his treasure is. His treasure is in the things of this world, the things that other people have, that he looks at and says, that person is a successful person. That person is one that I admire. That person is someone that I want to be like. Which, if that's the case, growing in grace, the opposite of that, we might find that we treasure things of a more valuable, a more eternal value. Where your heart is, there your treasure will be. Put your heart and your treasure in heaven. Put your focus on the things, if we have been risen with Christ, let's focus on things that are above. Over and over again, we see that picture of those who have been recipients of the grace of God, who have had this problem of sin removed from their life. What is it to provoke in us? It's to provoke a desire for something that is greater than what just the Joneses around us have. That's a great point. What else?
I wonder how much his sin actually moved him to seek help.
Yeah.
It's almost like the consequences of his actions. Like it was only when the creditors were calling that he was having problems. Getting rejected for that one credit card, that seems to be the thing that like pushed him to actually seek help. And I mean, we never want to judge that in other people. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just thinking, if I was Mark and looking at this situation, am I approaching the root cause of this, the actual covetousness? Or am I just wanting to fix the symptoms of the problem and get that part fixed? If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Covetousness, it doesn't seem to really be addressed when it comes down to it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point I hadn't thought about. That the thing that spurs him into action is when he finally gets to this point where I've hit rock bottom, basically. I can't get another credit card. I've been maxed out. I've been denied by the bank. What was the underlying motives? And certainly the underlying motives may have been, I have nowhere else to turn. And so he turns to Jesus. But does he turn to that grace and understand, Lesson 4 talked about this, the price of it. The price of the grace. We think about that in relation to our sins at baptism. I was baptized into Christ because I have connected with the fact that my sins came at a great cost to Jesus. He died on the cross because of the sins that I have committed. Well, that's still true in this case study, where Mark is at, completely overrun with these covetous, greedy desires. Jesus died for this. Jesus died so that he would overcome this. Is he thinking about that as this new credit card comes in the mail, or is he thinking, this is just going to, I've made it. I've got back to where I can get these again. They look at me and they don't go, this guy's a risk anymore. So we're back to the life that we wanted to get to all along, maybe. I think that's a great point.
He'll go back to the elders directly. When you get a credit card that I don't get nothing back on, you'll make 2 or 3 payments on $500 or $1,000 and they extend your credit. You make 2 or 3 more payments and they extend it again. So he'll have to go back to the elders directly.
Yeah, you can find yourself in a world of trouble real quick, can't you?
And that happens stuff
Certainly. And
He ain't hiding nothing, he just thought he was.
And isn't all sin like that when we hide it? When, no matter what the sin is, we decide, okay, and again, we're looking at this as Mark focusing on himself. And so there's a great risk that I think is justifiably seen here, that he's going to fall back into the same pattern because he's looking at himself saying, yeah, I've learned my lesson. I can get through this. I know what I'm doing now. But when we get in that situation, and then we start kind of, oh, well, let's cover that up a little bit. Next thing we know, that the thing, what we're covering up, gets deeper and deeper. We have to start piling it up on it to try to cover it. Hank?
Kind of reminds me of Ananias and Sapphira. They keep back a portion, what they did wasn't exactly sinful, but the lying and the hiding of the truth.
Absolutely. Man, I'm glad you brought that one up. I hadn't thought about that either, but that's absolutely a great picture of what is going on here. Ananias and Sapphira received the grace of God. They are baptized believers. They have learned that where we were is not where we wanted to be. It is leading us to death, and the only way out of this is through Christ. We've been baptized into Him, and then here comes Barnabas. Barnabas gives that, and it seems like the chapter before, everyone is just, they're impressed with what Barnabas has done. Well, hey, we want to be like that. We want everybody to be impressed with us. We're going to do that too, except for that maybe cost us too much to get that. We're going to hold some back. Again, they're focused inward. They're focused on what it is that I want, what it is that I desire, and not what it is that God desires and what He offers. They're not looking in that way at all. Mark, I think, is a great picture of that as well in this case study, someone that is looking to himself. We are just about out of time. Are there any other thoughts on question 3?
I would think that growing in grace would be, in his case, understanding his limitations. We've had a lot of case studies where, there's been, especially the young couple that had to go to the elders, that you need to understand limitations.
Yeah.
You can't put yourself in situations because, Satan is very wise in knowing what temptations are going to lead people into certain sin. And to understand that is growing in grace. You understand that you can't be in certain situations because you have limitations.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes we think of that phrase, limitations, as I'm not strong enough, instead of thinking of it as not necessarily a measure of my strength, but just of wisdom. This is a terribly unwise situation for me to put myself back into. I think we had one more.
Just real quick, 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, just because we think we have a right to do something doesn't mean that it's going to be the best choice.
Absolutely. And then ending in chapter 10, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. We think we have a right. We think we have the strength. We think we don't need this limitation. It can certainly lead us into a dangerous place. Thank you all for your comments. If you want to look over the passages at the top of page 24, 2 Peter 1, 2 Peter 3, and Philippians 1, 2, and 3, those verses that it talks about there. We're going to talk about that on Wednesday night and try to get some pictures of what it looks like biblically to grow in God's grace. Thank you, guys.